Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
And welcome back, everybody, to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is Robert Koshu, serving as host today, and I am joined by I'm going to call it two very special people. So first of all, I want to welcome one of our most ardent listeners and Discord participants, Helena Nash, to the podcast. So welcome, Helena.
Hello, thank you very much, Robert. Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for letting me join in today.
And if you didn't catch that, we have one other person on the podcast today, Mr. Chris Coppola. Chris, do you have anything to say?
Hi, good people.
There we go. I was starting to wonder if he froze.
Please understand. Yeah, I was triggering Robert because he did have a computer issue in the pre-discussion. So I even held my head still for a second there.
You did very well with that. So
scarily effective.
So we are going to do some deep cut British history that might just reorder the world, something on the course of what we usually do around here. So we're going to be looking, and I want to say Evan suggested this, Chris. Is that correct? Was this an Evan suggestion?
Maybe. I'm unsure.
Evan was the first person to comment on it in the Discord, but it was on a list of topics that maybe Don had put up way back.
Okay.
Using the power of Control F in the Discord. That's what it looked like.
All right. And Chris, so we are going to kick off with the Profumo Affair.
Profumo
Affair. Yeah. Sorry, my power just flipped again. As we were going through. So if I disappear, Chris will take over. I'm going to set everybody up for that, just in case, because it sounds like my power seems to not like me today. For whatever reason. So we're going to set this up, and Chris or Helena, whoever feels more adequate to give us the formal background on this whole thing, please do so to tell us what happened in today's timeline.
So, Chris, I don't know where we need to start to kind of bring people up to speed. Do we start in 1961 with some parties in big houses in London, maybe?
So just to make it very clear for all of our American listeners, in 1776, after we broke away, Britain still was a thing, and it had its old development, all of that. It still existed. So let's fast forward about 100.
I thought you were going to do a very long intro.
No.
And then George III said this. Wow.
So, yeah, I think 61. So basically, most Americans are familiar, Winston Churchill during the Second World War. He loses in 45. There's the second Labor government. He comes back in 51, and that is basically the government we're talking about now. There are some changes. Churchill dies. Eden comes in. Eden steps down. Macmillan comes in. But this is basically the government that is in power for these parties in 61 that we're talking about.
So, shall I just set the scene of what England, Britain, UK is like around about that time? That might be an idea.
Please do. Yeah, let's set that up.
Welcome, dear listener, to the 1960s. So, the UK is finally getting away from World War II. We've had rationing into the mid-50s. We did not finish the war in 1945 and go back to good times for all. and plenty for all. It's been the 50s were hard work. 1961, Britain is, for a lot of people, starting to swing. Not for everyone, not for my family, certainly. But if you were from a certain background or you were in a certain place in time, exciting things were happening. The classes were mixing. There was a bit more money to go around, and bright young things from all social stratas might just bump into each other in exciting places like Cliveden. It's not Cliveden, as I thought for a long time. This is the stately home of Lord Astor, west of London in Buckinghamshire. And this is a place where the high society and aristocrats like Lord Astor might mix with all number of other people. Politicians, let's call them foreign visitors from other embassies, and attractive young models from modest or humble backgrounds. And among those would be John Profumo, currently the Secretary for War, which is an incredibly emotive term and one that would eventually become the Defense Minister, Minister of Defense, but at the time was the Secretary of War.
This is one of those carryover things for an American audience. There is somebody called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think the best way to put that would be an American vice president. They are considered the number 2. I believe they live at 11 Downing Street.
So, yeah, that's right. So the Chancellor lives at 11. I think the big 3 below the PM is the Chancellor, holds the purse strings, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary.
There is an American equivalent.
Yeah.
Foreign Secretary would be Secretary of State, and this is Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of Defense, right. Yeah. Secretary of War. John Profumo. John Profumo, a man in his 40s at the time, meets at Cliveden House a young aspiring actress model, 19 years old, called Christine Keeler, an attractive brunette. They have an affair, and that is put together. They're introduced by a guy called Stephen Ward. And Stephen Ward, in the real timeline, plays a large role in the Profumo Affair. He is an introducer. He is a man who introduces, he hosts parties, he introduces young models to aristocrats and politicians.
He's an osteopath.
Character. And is an osteopath.
Which kind of a doctor. He's also a little bit of an artist, is how he technically supports himself.
Yep.
He kind of, would you say bohemian is a good?
Yeah, I think so. Again, so there's a wide range of ages here. He's in his 40s. I think Profumo is a little older. Like you say, he'll go to parties. He'll sit sketching, and these are pretty racy parties. I think there is a dearth of clothing at quite a lot of these parties, but he tends to be a little bit of more of an observer. But his role as an osteopath means he gets to mix with a lot of the upper crust and introduce them to people. At the very least, he likes partying. And
we're going to talk a little bit. Let's introduce Ivanov.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's Ivanov or Yev.
Yeah, he is the officially, he is the naval attaché to the Soviet embassy in London. Unofficially, he's a GRU resident. GRU is Soviet military intelligence. Because Astor and moves in these kind of circles, MI5 is actually using these parties to try and incriminate and recruit Ivanov as a double agent. Not a stupid idea. Not a bad idea. I'm thinking about well, you know what? You did mention you are more of a movie person, so let me go ahead and talk about Goldfinger. I promise this will make sense in a second. If you remember Goldfinger, James Bond goes to Goldfinger's ranch in the United States,
Hmm.
and the CIA agent he meets has a heavy Texas twang and comes off as almost like a county sheriff type. And there was this view in intelligence circles that the British are the big leagues. They actually had flipped several important Soviet colonels and had gained a lot of human intelligence. If you look at the Cold War, a lot of the human intelligence that the Americans got inside the Soviet Union was actually from the British. That kind of went both ways, though.
Yep. As we know. As we were talking off podcast about the Cambridge Five, Burgess and McLean,
Yes.
etc., etc. As far as I know, Ivanov was a chess playing buddy of the Profumo set. So just to paint the picture, there's a weird social web, and the center of this web is Stephen Ward, a vicar's son, osteopath, stroke sketch artist, stroke social butterfly arranger fixer thing. We have got Yevgeny Ivanov, was it naval attaché from the Soviet embassy. We've got Jack Profumo, Secretary of War. We've got Lord Astor. And at the other end of the social spectrum, we've got 16 to 19-year-olds like Christine Keeler and her young blonde friend, Mandy Rice Davis. They are partying and they're getting on. And that starts in 61. And they have this on again, off again affair throughout 1961 and 1962, right?
Who does?
So primarily Christine Keeler is setting with John Profumo. She likes
because she also has affairs with other people we've just been talking about. Does she not?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. She has at least a one-night stand with Ivanov. At least a one-night stand. And she also gets involved with shadier characters who she just meets. She goes to Notting Hill with some friends to score some weed. And that's where she meets.
I'm going to have to ask you to pause for a second. As an American, I have a very, very specific idea of what Notting Hill is.
Right.
It is not the Notting Hill. It is.
Aha. So thank you, Richard Curtis. So yeah, this is something people say to these days. So Notting Hill, West London Borough, now known for things like the Notting Hill Carnival, which is great, and the rom-com Notting Hill, Hugh Grant, Julia Roberts, right? In the 60s, it's not been gentrified, not been gentrified at all. I think
I'm thinking about this time. My grandfather actually was working at the World Produce Market in downtown New York, which was slummy. It's now ground zero. So neighborhoods change over time. That's why I paused and said,
yeah. So apparently it was a place where they went because they knew they could get hold of some drugs. And she goes to a cafe, meets a guy rejoicing in the name of Lucky Gordon. And look, we can't know exactly what Christine Keeler's thought processes are, but generally she makes some terrible choices with the men that she associates with. Long story short, she gets stalked by an abusive and violent guy by the name of Lucky Gordon, who once sold her some weed. She, in order to get Lucky Gordon off her back, gets another guy who's sweet on her, called Johnny Edgecombe, who apparently also went by the nickname The Edge, not to be confused with the guitarist from U2.
We'll get to them later.
We'll get to those. Honestly, we will get back to Profumo.
Yeah, we will.
We will. We will. So this is her life. Her life is like it's a real drama. It's a real soap opera, and she trades one bad guy for another to get Lucky Gordon off her back. She makes overtures to Johnny Edgecombe, who slashes this guy's face in a nightclub that kind of drives him away. But now she's got these two guys. They're both violent. They're both obsessive and possessive of Christine Keeler, a very attractive young, pretty woman. And they keep cropping up throughout 1961 and 1962, turning up at her house and making a nuisance of themselves.
Whose house?
Ah, good point. It's not her house. Thanks for asking me that, Chris. We are talking about a mews. If you don't know what a mews is, it's a quiet little side street in a quiet little part of London, and this flat is owned by Stephen Ward. Stephen Ward was often known as the flatmate or roommate of Christine Keeler, and sometimes her friend Mandy Rice Davies, who would stay there. There's not much suggestion that there was a romantic connection, I don't think, particularly between Keeler and Ward. But
he's an 18-year-old. He owns property. That's all we need to know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So all of that is going on. At the same time, MI5 are looking at this naval attaché. They're then working out, can we flip him? Let us talk to a fellow that we know has connections with him, Stephen Ward. And this is where things start to get really messy, right? Because then they put pressure. This is MI5, British domestic intelligence, to draw Ivanov in more so that they can flip him. They are also aware, because they're MI5, that Ivanov has had at least a brief liaison with this girl, Christine Keeler, and they're also aware that she has had a somewhat longer but also sporadic relationship with the Secretary of State, John Profumo. All of this is going on. How do we get to the scandal in what was essentially Christine Keeler? A, needs money. B, needs the police to get Johnny Edgecombe and Lucky Gordon off her back. Things have happened. Things have gone violently, badly wrong.
One would hope just this violent stalkery relationship would be enough, but it's not.
No. The police, it's hard to tell, but from what I've read, basically hold over Christine Keeler that say, look, we'll get these bad guys off your back, but we need material. And I can't remember, is it that they want dirt on Stephen Ward or not? I cannot remember. But things
Assistance in flip, things that will help us flip Ivanov.
Right. Word starts to leak out slowly with the tabloid press that there are swinging parties going on, highly placed people. There's one or two of those gossip columns that never quite mentions people in the way that they would these days, that say, Lord X seen exiting from the back of the building as Miss Y enters, etc., etc. Things start to get messy. Newspapers start to ask around. Christine Keeler needs money. Newspapers can offer her money if she can give them something. She gives them information ultimately about John Profumo, all of which starts to come out in 1963. There's a series of court cases. There is the trial of Lucky Gordon. I think he's acquitted for his violent acts. I think there's a trial of Johnny Edgecombe.
Gordon's, as I remember, convicted, later released on appeal.
Right. Absolutely. And the newspapers sent blood. The name of Profumo, very well known, obviously, highly placed cabinet minister, in association with Stephen Ward, the social fixer, and a young actress stroke model, which they would always say as a euphemism for prostitute. And it's not clear whether she was or not. There comes a point where Profumo's position is untenable. He's actually on holiday in Venice, and he is recalled recalled to London by the PM, Harold Macmillan, the aging Harold Macmillan, because he's been mentioned one too many times. He at first denies in the Parliament that he had a relationship with Christine Keeler, because in Parliament you can be asked anything. Although Britain does have stringent libel laws, famously so, there is a thing called parliamentary.
Played an effect with this. There was a previous scandal that people had literally been sued and had gone to jail. Journalists had. So that's one of the reasons the journalists are a little gun shy when Keeler starts coming out with her stories.
And then, so what the opposition does, what the newspapers can't. Opposition or people in Parliament, in the Commons, can use parliamentary privilege to say things that would get you sued outside of Parliament. Parliamentary privilege. So, and I cannot remember the name of the. Is it Whig? I think. Can't remember his name. It's Whig, right? It basically says in Parliament, in the Commons, John Profumo Affair. Not unlinked to a Soviet naval attaché, and he's at least one removed from this. Profumo denies it. More evidence comes to light. Keeler's got a letter. Christine Keeler's got a letter, which is a letter from John Profumo that says, "My darling." And eventually it's too much for the Prime Minister. Harold Macmillan, old school, can't take it anymore. Profumo's recalled. He makes a full-ish confession. It's quite a wordy one. In 1963, steps down, relinquishes his position as Secretary of War and his position as an MP, and lives a much more modest, out of the spotlight life up until the 1990s, I think. But that affair, the Profumo Affair in 1963, has a catastrophic, damaging effect on the image of the Conservative government, the Macmillan government, and what we call the establishment with a capital E, which is hypocritical, they lie, sex-obsessed, can't be trusted. And what's this about Soviet attachés, sex parties, gangsters, and gunshots?
I mean, there's that. We talked a little bit about the Cambridge spies. Some of them have already been discovered. These were basically, if you can imagine this, if you had the right parents and went to the right school, when you graduated, even as a communist, you basically got handed jobs. You were members of clubs and you got handed very important jobs just because somebody knew your parents and you were a member of the right group, in effect.
And in 1963, we just had Kim Philby, famously one of the moles, fleeing to the Soviet Union, having been.
Yes. Right? So there's a lot going on there.
A lot. And that affects a whole load of things, primarily that the Conservative government lose the 1964 election. And Britain gets Harold Wilson's Labour government, a more liberal, obviously socialist or Labour government, pushed through a lot of reforms, and it seemed to be a lot less scandal prone than the last gasp, perhaps, arguably, of the old school, more aristocratic, conservative government. And then you get the rest of the history as we know it. The words "the Profumo Affair" or Profumo is a shorthand for scandal in British culture, British government, journalism, and popular discussion for at least 2 or 3 decades after that. It is by no means the last scandal. It's not even the last sex scandal. People and politicians being what they are, but it is one that becomes a byword for privilege, hypocrisy, corruption. And arguably, Christine Keeler brings down the Conservative government in 1964.
So, what's our fork?
We did talk, didn't we? We had ideas.
Yes.
And it turns out we both had the same idea, actually.
So, the idea we came up with, at one point, the other Edgecombe,
Johnny Edgecombe,
shows up at Ward's house with a gun and blindly fires into the house, I guess hoping to hit Keeler. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe he was incredibly drunk, but he has a gun. It goes off. I think it hits the walls. I think you can see the bullet marks.
Multiple. This is not the gun goes off. There are multiple bullet holes.
Yeah.
If he does hit Keeler, she passes away. She is not there to sell her story to the newspapers. And it is very possible that the Tory Macmillan government wins the election in 64, which they are due for. They have to have one.
Yeah.
So and that was a very close election, right?
Yeah, in the real world, it was very close, in fact, yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is why I think Harold Wilson called a snap election just, I don't know, a year and a bit into his prime ministership, just to get a better mandate, which he does in the real timeline.
So, in this case, without the affair, with Macmillan still basically at full strength, we think he wins. We think a Macmillan could better yet, the Tories would win, right? If the Tories win, we posited that basically Macmillan was getting up there. He would have led the Tories through the election and not stood for leadership. So there would be a new election after the election. It really doesn't matter to most Americans, but picture the Speaker of the House. You elect a body, and that body then elects their person in charge. Speaker of the House in the United States, but that is how a prime minister is elected. So similar to I guess nowadays, Nancy Pelosi, she keeps her seat, but she decides not to run for leadership. And that opens it up to a leadership election within the Tories for who becomes the next prime minister.
And it's entirely possible to just step down. You can be prime minister and simply say, for whatever reasons, I step down. Wilson in the real timeline does it. David Cameron does it. Various other people step down. You don't have to just die or lose an election. You could win an election and step down 6 months later. And Macmillan was not a young man. He was a little bit in the real world. The Profumo Affair has an effect on his health as well. Anyway, it's entirely possible that they squeak through the election. Macmillan, I don't know. He has a health scare, or he's just had enough. He feels the pressure. He steps down, and then they have the Conservatives would have an internal election for PM. He doesn't quite, I don't think, get to hand over unless there's something I don't understand. But generally there's a party.
They don't officially hand over. Once it is put about who the prime minister that just led us to an election victory prefers, that person gets a bump and is very likely to.
Yeah, the anointed successor is often known. For example, the Blair Brown thing was very back in the early 2000s was a thing. So where are we? 64-ish.
Yes,
Macmillan's
64.
going to step down. We then might have another prime minister, and who are we thinking? Who's around now? Who hasn't been scandalized out of
Again,
out of
Profumo was not a nobody. He was very highly placed. And he's very likely to be able to win this, as he during almost I picture him a little bit like a Kennedy, in that he was actually in Parliament during the war, but he had served in the war in an active combat role. In other words, he's not an Eisenhower level of leading everything. He had, and so he's of that generation, and I think it's possible that he comes in and takes over as a new generation of Tory leader almost.
Yes, because in the real world, the real successor is Sir Alec Douglas Hume. Again, somewhat more of the older generation, and bold accounts, very stiff and not terribly charismatic. And one thing we know about Profumo is he has a bit of charisma. About him. So so it's entirely possible that we end up with Prime Minister John Profumo in late 64, early 65, and now we have a very interesting setup. Not only do we have a Conservative government where there was none, this means, in broad terms, we don't get the Harold Wilson Labour government from 64 to 70, who pushed through a whole load of social reforms. Very briefly, those would be things like comprehensive schools. What do you call comprehensive schools over your side? But not. We did have grammar schools. And secondary modern comprehensive schools that are open to all. It's the democratization of education for high school kids.
I believe it's high school. This is basically like 14 to 18 year olds. That's a high school.
Yeah. So there's that. There's the pill has already been legalized, but we get the Abortion Act comes in later in the 60s. Sex Discrimination Act, which decriminalizes homosexuality, comes in, and generally a push towards technology. The famous line from Harold Wilson is the white heat of technology. All of that is what we get in the real timeline. We don't get that necessarily, I don't think, from a Conservative Party, even though, the 60s are swinging, that's for sure. The Beatles are there. Mary Quant is there.
Beatles have already, I believe, when is this election 64? Beatles have appeared on Ed Sullivan. Beatles were a thing.
Right. Love Me Do is what, 1962? So, we got Beatlemania. Beatlemania. We got Doctor Who as well, for what it's worth, but that is less important this time around. So we don't get certain things that we would have got from a Wilson government. There's some other things that we were thinking about that you might get. And we're looking now, Chris, at what? 1965?
65. As we were talking off podcast, we gravitated towards almost making this an American episode, and I said we need to keep it British. I am standing in and saying we need to move it over back to them. But we are what we are. Taking a step back and you want to talk about a plate, trying to figure out where to start. Right about the time of the election in Great Britain is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Long story short, the United States Navy thinks it's attacked by some North Vietnamese boats, and the United States Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which was the congressional push, one of the major events in the beginning of the American involvement in Vietnam. But we don't have troops. This, August of 64 Gulf of Tonkin resolution allows Johnson, it basically tells Johnson, do what you think you need to. And what Johnson thinks he needs to is just bomb North Vietnam. That's what he's doing in 64. August of 65 is when he starts deploying U.S. ground troops. And we're not going to get into what are advisors versus ground troops. 65, there are Americans there whose only job is to kill. And the United States does reach out to other nations trying to build a coalition. It's one of the things a lot of people don't realize is there were Australian and South Korean troops in Vietnam, and I believe the Philippines, fighting with the Americans. And they did reach out to Great Britain. Wilson told them to pound sand.
Yep.
We don't think Profumo would, because we were talking off. I think this is very much akin to the Second Iraq War, where the United States is able to convince Great Britain. I mean, we were going down the list, and I said, I believe, if we could somehow switch Poland to the other side of the Iron Curtain, it would be the exact same people. It was the Australians, it was the Americans, it was the British that went into Iraq, and that went into, in this case, South Vietnam. And one of the things we talked about earlier, and this was very important to American thinking around Vietnam, was the Malay emergency. This was one of the first times that you had successfully had a counterinsurgency, and there were a lot of people that had led that effort that got nice contracting jobs with the Americans in Vietnam to try and tell them how to do it. And we said if Great Britain did send troops, this would basically be a model they would use. What we suggested is the place they would work is the place, maybe not geographically, but the place demographically most like Malaya, the Central Highlands. Basically, in Malaya, the communist insurgency pretty much lined up with the Chinese. The local Malays were not communist. That makes it very easy for them to stick out and be picked out. In the Central Highlands, the United States in the war deployed a lot of special forces into that area because those people are not ethnically Vietnamese. They're Hmong, they're Montagnard, and again, North Vietnamese stick out there. They don't stick out around other Vietnamese. So we posited that basically Great Britain would, if they sent, troops, similar, I think, a little bit to what happens in World War II. You have an entire geographic area. That's the British. Here's the American.
Yep.
And that's what they would do. No, this does not change much of anything about how Vietnam goes.
Yeah.
What it
because Britain's not going to be we're not going to be committing huge forces.
Right.
Britain's we're downsized. Since World War II, we're not throwing the might of the empire around here. The empire is in the past.
There is no more empire.
There's going to be a token force to show that proportionate to Britain's ability, much reduced.
Very skilled, though.
Yes, like you say, they're building on their experience. And Britain, going back to the 40s, Chindits, etc., etc., they've got skills, and it frees American forces up to do other things, I guess.
Just not successfully.
Yeah.
Now, playing that forward to 68, like we said, the
Yep.
big turning point there is February and the Tet Offensive. Nothing at all changes, except that the Americans start realizing we need to get out. Britain, if they held an election in 64, they're due for another, aren't they?
Yeah, they can roll it up. They can put it off to 69 for 5 years. But let's flip back to Britain for a moment and see what's Britain like from 65 to 68, where we are now in a war. We're now in a foreign adventure. There are British soldiers dying. There are anti-war protests in the real time now. You just know there's going to be more now. We're going to be getting our own version of all the things that are happening back home in America are going to be happening in the UK. Bodies coming home, protests. We talked briefly, this is something I think Robert brought up and I'd also considered. National service had been abolished in 1960, so that wasn't happening. But
national service means what? What is national service?
It is a mandatory service in one of the armed forces for young men between the ages of something and something, and I cannot remember. My father was of the right age. He actually joined up voluntarily, which meant he get to choose the service: Navy, Air Force, Army. But essentially, young men from the war onwards, obviously there was drafts during the war, but national service followed on from that, and up until 1960, all young men in Britain would be required to spend 2 to 3 years in one of the services. That could be as dull as, like my father, sitting in an airbase somewhere in Germany, playing cards whilst people erected radio masts and getting good at poker. Or it could have been that you were sent to some flashpoint around the world, like the Suez Crisis.
I find that very funny. My father did the exact same thing.
No.
Joined the United States Air Force and learned cribbage from RAF officers up in Goose Bay, Canada.
Oh my God! There you go. So, look, they say join the forces and learn a skill, and so that's amazing. So that's all had been happening. 60 onwards, that's not happening. Young men have been freed up to grow their hair long, learn the guitar, go off to Hamburg and form a pop group, and do all the other cool things that you might want to do. There's an argument to say that if Britain's getting enmeshed in Vietnam, they might, perhaps not a full-on 100% national service thing, but they might institute some sort of limited version of it, maybe.
Or, by the way, a modified national service, in that you have to do some. It's not a military service. Hey, you have to volunteer. You have to spend 2 years working in the NHS, or
the merchant navy, or one of the ancillary things. Could well be. But it shades Britain's experience of the 60s slightly differently to how it was. I think, Chris, we were positing that there's going to be protests. Certainly, we could definitely imagine
many more. I mean, the key, the two things: one, Great Britain is involved. Two, random British kids are coming home.
Yep.
If these are people that chose the military and went in, it hits differently. It hits differently.
Absolutely, yeah. And if there's a draft stroke national service, that does hit differently. You would get draft dodging, national service dodging. You would get well-known figures avoiding the draft. And I did suggest that this could seriously affect England's chances of winning the World Cup in 1966 if we just lost one key player in the team. You'd get well-known personalities, and John Lennon was the name that immediately came to mind to several of us. very publicly protesting against the war, maybe staging, like a sleep-in ahead of time, very
And I think
publicly.
we didn't talk about this explicitly, but I think one of the dynamics, at least Americans pick up within the Beatles, is Lennon wants to be political. Lennon wants to have a love-in against the war. He wants to come out and do all these things. McCartney wants to write songs about holding his girlfriend's hand.
Exactly. Yeah. George wants to go off and expand his mind in India.
And Ringo's just happy to be along for the ride.
Just loving it, whatever happens.
But that may lead to an increased friction and a earlier split.
Yep. Yes, I don't think the Beatles get to 1970.
Oh,
no. Do not. That very much doesn't happen. We may get Wings earlier, so that's just part of the dystopian future that we could see earlier Wings.
No World Cup, and no. This isn't personal animus. What
a nightmare scenario for Britons. Nightmare scenario. So we are considering then that by the time it gets to 1968, there must be the government, I think, is going to be suffering from unpopularity because, hey, we've got our flavor of Vietnam now. There's going to be an election. It's going to be 1968 election. What do you think, Chris?
I mean, I think Wilson. The simple fact, I think, in both nations, in democracies, there's about a 12-year maybe expiration date on any government. It's more set in the United States because we have set presidential elections. They have to happen every 4 years. A unique feature, or maybe not unique, but one of the features of the British system is you can dissolve Parliament if you think you're more popular. You can dissolve Parliament and the clock resets. So instead of it being every 5 years, well, if you dissolved it, like you mentioned in 66, technically the clock resets and you don't have to hold it until 71. But
you can't dodge it forever, and there's definitely strong evidence to suggest that regardless of how many times you game the system, 12 years is kind of when people are going, we need a change, and you can see that in historically in the 20th and 21st century in the UK. So just a little encapsulated Harold Wilson, So in the real timeline, Wilson wins in 64. Calls a snap election in 66 to consolidate his leadership and gets a pretty respectable majority. That means he goes from 66 to 70. And that's so he's got a good amount of time there. Loses in 70 to the Conservatives, but, and this is rather unusual, he doesn't resign. He doesn't step down, which is usually what happens. You lose an election, you step down. There's a re-election for your losing party's leadership. He retains leadership. Bides his time, and returns to power, winning the election in 1974. That's in the real timeline.
To talk about somebody we're a little more familiar with. In 45, when Churchill lost, he stepped down. He walked away. He was not the leader of the Tories in minority under Attlee. That is normally what you do. Yeah.
And again, just another interesting thing about Harold Wilson. He in the real timeline ultimately steps down. He doesn't die. He doesn't lose an election. He's not voted out. He just says, I've had enough. And there's often speculation about what was going on behind the scenes. But that does mean in our timeline, in our PM Profumo timeline, Wilson will be not hanging around, he'll be campaigning as the leader of the opposition throughout the 60s. And I think we felt it's very probable that he would finally, in our timeline, become Prime Minister of Labour Party, 1968. Probably then. We need to probably flip back a little bit to Vietnam and how is Britain and the US going to try and get themselves out of this situation?
I think the interesting thing was, first, Nixon. Nothing else changes. Nixon still wins in the United States.
Yeah.
Nixon's policy of Vietnamization. And initially when we were talking, I said, wait a minute. How does this work? Because now you have another power involved in the negotiations to get out. If you believe Nixon, and that's a very big if, he spent his entire first administration trying to come up with a deal to get the United States out. Was he actually trying? Okay, we can argue this.
Yeah.
If the United Kingdom is already there, this just further complicates it. But I think the way Nixon, one of the things Nixon does is what's called Vietnamization. We will give South Vietnam supplies. We will train them on our way out the door so that we're not chased out, so that we're basically going to do basically what I believe it's Robert Thompson. Correct me if I'm wrong, and you may not even know who I'm talking about. You don't.
Assume I don't. Sorry.
Was the counterinsurgency expert from Malay that the United States had brought in. One of the things he would say is, stand up locals. You are here temporarily, but stand up the local people to do this. Well, I could just imagine the British have been screaming to do this, telling them we need to do this. Finally, the Americans I'm not going to say agree with the British opinion, but come to it among their own way.
Purely by coincidence, have a very similar conclusion. Yeah.
And so in 68, a Wilson, Nixon are trying to do the same thing. So actually, I think that gets out relatively easily. There's still residuals there. We didn't talk, but maybe the United States, because they're freed up, sends more forces into Cambodia. But I promised myself I was going to make this a British episode, and I'm going to make it a British episode.
Right.
So now we have Wilson coming in 68, implementing all of his reforms, or at least starting down all of the reforms you talked about.
Yeah. Because that means in reality, we talk about reforms, but these are real changes that will have been affecting people. There would have been more unplanned pregnancies. There would have been more, risky abortions. There would have been more men arrested or hounded for being caught with another guy. All of those things that in the 60s was eventually come to pass. Those things are still affecting people. Other kids are missing out on a decent education.
We did forget something.
Go on.
The letters in the 68 campaign.
Yes. Good call. We forgot the fly in the ointment. Let us return for a moment to the original scandal. So, in the original scandal, one of the things that comes up is that Christine Keeler has at least one love letter from John Profumo that his lawyer tries desperately to say that, yes, of course he called her my darling, but you see, his wife is Valerie Hobson, the noted film actress. He moves in theatrical circles. Everybody's called my darling. That letter is used in the real timeline as evidence in newspaper articles. But Christine Keeler's died in our timeline. But I'm going to tell you who hasn't died is her friend, Mandy Rice Davis. In later years, in the real timeline, just like Christine Keeler, they do sell their stories. And we feel that it is not unreasonable to think that Mandy, sitting on her friend's correspondence, knowing what she knows about the Prime Minister, which she does, has been biding her time. Or maybe just she needs the money, which is a common factor throughout the Christine Keeler story. Though that letter might well start to find its way to, let's say, a tabloid newspaper.
Especially because now this is the Prime Minister.
Oh yeah.
Now he's involved in an election campaign. All of these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. And I did briefly consider, I've written down in my planning notes various wilder concepts like MI5, deal with loose ends. But I'm not going to go down the
Oh, no.
dirty
No.
tricks route. The letter comes out, and that is really going to put the nail in the coffin for the embattled Profumo government in the '68 election. Scandal comes out, but later.
And what reminded me of what you were talking about is talking about all of these unwanted pregnancies, talking
Right.
about all of these social issues that
Mm.
in the United States, there was a large sense that wealthy kids could go to college, could go to Canada, could get preferments.
Yeah.
There's this is the rule, but if you have enough money, you can bend these rules.
Mm-hmm.
I think Profumo fits very much into that as well, in the sense that all of these reforms that you were just talking about,
Yep.
Wilson making, they're not reforms for the establishment. The establishment has always been able to do these things.
I've had all my education. I went to Eton. Good Lord.
These reforms are just letting everybody do it.
Yeah, I can't pretend to know what a Profumo government would think about that, but I think it's fair to
they're
say
Tories. They're establishment Tories.
They're not Harold Wilson, the social reformer, who's
Right.
a grammar school boy from a much less elevated background. They're not going to bother. They're not going to bother. They're going to put it off and fudge it and worry about foreign policy and economy and
Again,
those things.
Because it's okay for us.
Yeah, right. So all of that stuff, gets put off, and that puts a different complexion on a lot of people's lives throughout the '60s.
All of that, but it also puts. Let's kind of get finishing up. But it changes who labor is.
Yeah,
because these are very social issues. These are not. I mean, keep in mind, Wilson was a member of the Socialist International.
right.
These are, yes, it's a leftist party. It is an economically leftist party. The name of his party is Labor, and they mean it. In a big way. And his election in '64, he kind of takes a step back on some of the nationalization, on some of the economic issues. You were talking about, let technology lift everybody. Okay, technology can lift everybody. We don't need to, take over things.
Mm-hmm.
In a '68, where society has gotten to the point where these are the issues he's running and winning on, those are not technically traditional labor issues at this point. And what we had talked about is, does that, I think I used the phrase, does that Blairize labor earlier? In that, does it bring in maybe not Etonians? Labor's never gonna win them. But bring in shopkeepers' daughters. The phrase we used. Bring in. I mean, there is still a liberal party hanging around. Bring in liberals. Bring in, I guess, what would today be considered Lib Dems, people that are socially liberal, may not be on board for Labor's economic policy, but if that's what they're running on and that's what they're winning on, that can bring some of these middle class voters over to Labor, start building a coalition there. And I used the phrase "shopkeeper's daughter" for a very specific reason, didn't I?
Yes, good Easter egg there. Good Easter egg there. I think we agreed that we didn't think for one moment that the more famous shopkeeper daughter, Margaret Thatcher, would ever have appeared in the Labour circle.
Right. But no politician gets anywhere on their own.
No.
And if
No.
the people like her or that are from where she's from are Laborites, you may not see a Thatcher government in the 80s at all. You could really see a party realignment in Great Britain.
Yeah. And then that has knock-on effects for, well, all sorts of other things that you have already covered in other folks, you know. But if I Reagan, Falklands, fall of the Soviet Union, dealing with
we are recording this 2 weeks after the Red Ron episode, and I said, we just made Reagan a communist. I am not going to make Thatcher a Laborite. So yeah. This is something we love doing, is just completely realigning politics.
Yeah, and also let's briefly think about Britain going forwards in the 70s from a cultural or social point of view. Guess what? We've now got Vietnam trauma. Which is something that, you know, from this side is something, you know, I tend to see in terms of
on top of all of the empire trauma as well.
Right, and all of the other the things that weren't World War II that have happened since World War II, Suez, etc. Like that. I don't think we're going to go into a great deal of details, but there is trouble afoot in Northern Ireland for a start.
So this is where we were going to go. I told you want to talk about an Easter egg. This is an Easter egg. The Edge. Their song Sunday Bloody Sunday talks about what is called Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, which was a peaceful march to gain rights, equal rights for Catholic citizens of Northern Ireland that was attacked by the British Parachute Brigade. I think when we discussed this, I said the Paras would be in Benoit, not Belfast.
And this is 1972. So, right, there's Vietnam still a thing. Our Paras are now there.
Yeah. And also, if we have a Wilson government in charge, brand new coming in, their reaction may be a little more accommodationist rather than crackdown. And you know, we wanted to save this.
We've shaken history a little bit here. It's not hugely different, but we've slightly rattled the dice, and it only needs a couple of different numbers to come up. Things may play out differently there.
Yes.
Well,
for our own reasons, we both wanted to be very careful around that one.
There are people who know certain subject matters far better than us.
So yeah, I think we've completely redone British politics, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. we get probably in the 80s we get our own versions of First Blood.
Okay.
More importantly, and the A Team. There'll be a crack squad of Paras in the A Team.
Yeah, I'm picturing like kind of a Red Dawn in the moors of Scotland, possibly.
I am very much here for Red Dawn in the Highlands. Absolutely. But yeah, we get to add that into our national psyche, which is always interesting.
And I think it's an interesting thing to think about is, you know, we danced around the Beatles and the British invasion. I think if Great Britain has its own Vietnam experience, how does their interaction with American pop culture change? Because right now, Britain never had any. Britain's trauma was Suez and was all these other things, but it's a little bit different, and they address it differently than the Americans.
Yes. Yes. Well, how many members of the British invasion don't get to go to the States because they are serving? For example.
Exactly. Or things like that. Yeah.
Destroyed my 60s hits. As long as you still get painted black, I'm fine.
I mean, let's be perfectly honest. There is no way Keith Richards is going to pass an induction physical.
I want to see this. I want to see someone dramatize this now. Oh man, can you imagine him somewhere up in the Highlands at a base? Oh, that would be awesome.
So, wrapping it up, we have to wrap it up at some point. I want to thank you for coming on. I mean, you had reached out. You have been one of the active people. We're going to try and make a way for anybody to do it. I think it was an interesting comment we made before. Robert, I guess, knew the Texas branch of the A Fork in Time family.
Right.
We've never met. I've never met Dylan. I've never met Evan or anybody.
Right. I mean, you guys are all over the place. And I think we were talking off podcast. I said, I need a little map so I can have a little flag for Chris and a little flag for Robert.
I'm complicated because I claim different places depending upon who I'm trying to make fun of.
I mean, I've been drinking out of this mug throughout the entire podcast. I don't know whether that's a good thing or bad thing. It's literally my I Love New York mug, and it just happened to be the one I had with me. So I don't know if that was good or bad. I apologize.
Basically a John Lennon t-shirt, isn't it?
Wow. let's say it. Let's say it is. And I'm almost wearing Lennon glasses as well. I'm not going to insult my Liverpudlian friends by attempting the accent some other time.
All right. Thank you for coming on. Anybody else listening, get involved. We had been talking about this. If nobody could figure, you're in Britain at the moment. You are outside of London, I believe.
Yeah, I'm just north of London. It's getting dark out there now. Yep.
It's sunny here. We found a way to have you on. If people are interested, we will find a way, because we want to reach out, bring everybody together as much as we can, allowable. There are issues. If some of us have power outages that cut off in the middle of recordings. We make it happen.
Why's Robert's been so quiet this last hour? Wow.
Well, very simple. He lacks the connection of being the son of people that learned card games in the Air Force.
That's we formed a clique within the clique.
Yes. But thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And everybody reach out, get involved online. And just to close it out, if one should come across a fork in the road, what should they do?
I thoroughly recommend that you take it.
All right. See everybody next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.